Hello viewers! Do you have a red oil pressure warning light on your dashboard, despite the oil level being correct and the engine seemingly running fine? Or the oil gauge keeps showing some crazy numbers that don't make any sense? Well, one of the things that could be causing this is an oil pressure sensor, which does all the measurements. And now we're going to find out what happens if it goes bad, and more importantly, what to do if that's the case. Let's go! If the oil pressure sensor fails and doesn't give accurate readings, it will trick your car into thinking that the oil pressure itself is actually off, causing some of the following. One of the most common things that's likely to happen when this sensor fails is a big red oil pressure warning light. This happens when the ECU determines that the oil pressure in your car is either too low or too high. That's in theory at last. The thing is, if the sensor is faulty, this warning will come on even if the oil pressure is within acceptable limits. The easiest way to determine if this is the case is by hooking up the oil pressure gauge and manually checking your engine's oil pressure. If these readings are normal, there is a good chance the sensor has gone bad. If your car has an oil pressure gauge, it might be showing some improbable or even impossible readings. This probably doesn't call for much explanation. The gauge relies on data coming from the oil pressure sensor, and if this is not correct, you'll see some odd readings on your dashboard. For instance, the pressure may be off the scale while the engine is idling, or it may drop to almost zero when you rev it up. And this is exactly the opposite of what the oil pressure in a healthy engine should do. In most newer cars, the oil pressure sensor sends its readings directly to the ECU, which then shares this data with other vehicle components, such as the dashboard. And if there is some sort of an electrical issue with the sensor, short, open circuit or what have you, the ECU will notice this and trigger a check engine light. This also means there will be a corresponding error code in the vehicle's memory, which you can retrieve using a diagnostic scanner. And if the oil pressure sensor is faulty, you can expect one of these codes. Lastly, the oil pressure sensor may develop a leak, with oil dripping underneath your car as a result. This is because these sensors are designed to be an integral part of the engine's lubrication system, which puts them in direct contact with pressurized oil. However, if the sensor comes loose or breaks, the oil may start leaking out. Some car makers are known for having this problem, where the oil pressure sensor leaks oil through the center of its body, filling the block connector and spraying the engine bay with oil. You can check if this is the case by looking for any oil leaks around the pressure sensor. Furthermore, remove the sensor's block connector to check inside for any traces of oil. If you find any oil in either of these locations, then you'll need to replace the sensor. You can also visually inspect the sensor while the engine is idling and make sure there are no signs of any oil leaking from the sensor's body. Most modern cars have an oil pressure sensor fitted somewhere on the engine block. It allows the vehicle's ECU to determine the, yep, you guessed it, current pressure of the oil within the engine. With it, the engine can passively monitor whether the oil system loses pressure. If for whatever reason your engine does lose its oil pressure, this can result in major damage to the rest of the engine, which is the main reason that is constantly monitored. The pressure is created by the vehicle's oil pump, which simply lifts the engine oil from the sump to the cylinder block and head to both cool and lubricate the various moving engine components. If the oil pressure drops, then your engine is no longer able to stay lubricated or cooled efficiently, and this can result in component seizing, causing irreversible damage and a hefty repair bill. And for that reason, the oil pressure is constantly monitored. So, as soon as your oil pressure light comes on, switch off the engine and don't restart it until it's been repaired. By doing so, you'll prevent further damage from taking place. The next question we want to answer is where to find the oil pressure sensor. Well, due to the nature of its job, it has to be somewhere on the engine itself, either on the block or in some cases the cylinder head. Sometimes this sensor will be fitted on the oil filter housing or, like here, on the oil cooler just near it. Obviously, the exact location of the oil pressure sensor will differ depending on the model and the engine it has. So if you're having trouble finding it in your car, leave a question in the comment section below. Someone will probably know the answer. As said earlier, you can verify if the oil pressure is within some given limits by measuring its actual value with a pressure tester. This, in essence, is an external gauge that you'll connect instead of the sensor and see what the actual oil pressure is. Once completed, this will reveal if the sensor's readings are incorrect or if, more worryingly, the oil pressure is off. But for the sake of the argument, let's assume the sensor apparently gives incorrect data. In that case, you can check the signal coming from it, which is often a pretty straightforward job. All you need to do is measure the resistance it gives and compare it with those that are correct for the specific pressure range. As for the actual values for your own car, that's what you'll have to find out in a repair manual or some other similar reliable source. Now, if the oil pressure is within some correct range, you might be tempted to just ignore the warning light and drive your car with it on. After all, it's just a false reading, it's not like something's wrong with the engine or anything like that. And while this is true, there's one key drawback to this plan. Should the oil pressure drop for any reason, there won't be anything to warn you. This means your engine will not be lubricated sufficiently while running, which can, and usually will, cause irreversible and costly damage. So with that in mind, it really doesn't make sense to take this risk, especially when considering it's not too expensive to replace the sensor. Which brings us to the last question. Being in essence a simple component with no sensitive or complex electronics, the oil pressure sensor usually doesn't cost too much. For most cars, this will be less than $50, and you can go for an OEM part or one made by a reputable aftermarket brand, as these usually work equally well. Even more, replacing the pressure sensor is usually an easy job. Just unplug the connector, undo the old sensor, put the new one in its place, reconnect the wiring, and you're good to go. Even if you're having a mechanic for you to do this, you shouldn't expect to pay more than a half an hour or hour of labor. So viewers, that would be all about the oil pressure sensor, how it works, what happens if it fails, and most importantly, what to do if that's the case. I hope this video was helpful, and if so, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. But if not, and your oil pressure warning light is still on, something else might be causing the issue. To continue troubleshooting, check out other videos here or visit our site mechanicbase.com for more detailed automotive repair guides. Bye!